Live testimonials from real witnesses who claim to have seen the unexplainable. Some say it's Bigfoot.
I swear to you it was huge. Taller than any man I've ever seen. I thought it was Bigfoot, no doubt. The way it moved through the trees like it wasn't even bothered by the snow. What else could it be?
Others believe it's a Wendigo.
Those eyes, hollow and starving, like it was looking right through me. I'm telling you, that was no animal. That was a Wendigo. What else could make you feel that kind of cold deep in your bones?
Or even a banshee. Whatever it is, they all agree. This encounter has changed them forever. I heard it before I saw it. A woman's voice, soft but chilling. When I finally saw her, she was pale, gaunt, like a banshee, warning me that something terrible was coming. You don't forget a sight like that.
Daniel Kingsley stepped out of his SUV, breathing in the cold, crisp air of the mountains. The cabin, a small, rustic structure, stood solitary among towering pines, its wooden exterior weathered by years of harsh winters. It was exactly what he needed, a place to disconnect from the pressures of his world. As CEO of a multinational corporation, Daniel's days had been consumed by never-ending emails, board meetings, and an incessant stream of demands. This retreat was his chance to switch off and reset. He unloaded the supplies from the car, canned goods, bottled water, some dry firewood, and a few comforts to keep him going for the week. A handful of books, classic literature he had always meant to read, but never had the time for. And his phone, though he knew there would be no service here. That was the point after all. No calls, no distractions. The cabin, isolated miles from the nearest town, was nestled deep in the forest, cut off from the world, a deliberate choice on his part. It had no Wi-Fi, and his phone showed 0 bars of reception. The nearest hint of civilization was a small, sleepy village about a 2-hour drive away, but with the coming snowstorm, it might as well have been a lifetime away. As Daniel placed the last of his provisions on the wooden kitchen counter, he allowed himself a rare moment of contentment. He checked his phone one last time. No service, no emails, and then switched it off, slipping it into a drawer as if sealing away the last tether to his chaotic life. He hadn't felt this free in years. The cabin was small but comfortable. A fireplace dominated one wall, its stone hearth stained with the black marks of past fires. A large window looked out onto the forest, the snow beginning to fall softly outside. He settled in quickly, unpacking his few belongings and lighting a fire. The warmth spread quickly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel felt at peace. The rest of the day passed in pleasant tranquility. He read one of the novels, a Hemingway classic, and allowed himself to drift off in the worn leather armchair beside the fire. When the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the cabin, Daniel fixed himself a simple dinner, accompanied by a glass of wine he had brought along for the occasion. It was the kind of peaceful solitude he had dreamed about for months. That night, as he climbed into the small but comfortable bed in the corner of the cabin, the snow had begun to fall more heavily. Through the window, he could see the flakes thickening, swirling in the wind. A blizzard was coming, but Daniel wasn't worried. He had enough supplies to last weeks if necessary. If anything, the storm would enhance the isolation he sought, cutting off any thought of the outside world. He welcomed it. As he drifted off to sleep, the wind began to howl outside, rattling the shutters of the cabin, but inside, the fire was still burning low, and the warmth lulled him into a deep, dreamless sleep. Daniel awoke to a deathly quiet. The howling wind had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. He rubbed his eyes and sat up, stretching before making his way to the door. When he opened it, the sight that greeted him took his breath away. The world had been transformed into a sea of white. The snow had piled up during the night, burying the roads and pathways. It was easily several feet deep, but Daniel felt no concern. He had planned for this. If anything, the sight was comforting. Now there was truly no way for anyone to reach him, and he could focus on what mattered, his own peace of mind. Stepping onto the porch, he inhaled deeply, the cold air sharp in his lungs. The world was a blank slate, untouched and pristine. That was when he noticed something strange. A set of tracks in the snow, barely visible in the distance. They were faint, as if someone or something had walked through during the storm. But that was impossible, he thought. There was no one out here, no one for miles. Daniel stared at the tracks for a moment, the logical part of his brain trying to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe an animal, a trick of the wind. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. There had to be an explanation. Still, the sight of those tracks unsettled him, a flicker of doubt creeping into the back of his mind. He turned back inside, shutting the door, and pushing the image of the tracks from his thoughts. He had come here to escape, not to get caught up in nonsense. After starting a pot of coffee, he settled back into his chair, picking up his book once more. He even laughed at himself, brushing off the unease that had briefly taken hold. Later, with the fire crackling in the hearth and a soft tune playing from his phone, the music he had downloaded before disconnecting, Daniel felt the familiar comfort of solitude wrap around him again. The tracks were forgotten, and as he read through the morning, the blizzard continued to howl outside. Inside, he was warm, safe, and alone. At least, that's what he told himself. The night outside the cabin was absolute. No streetlights, no distant glow from a nearby town, just pure blackness, stretching out endlessly into the cold. Daniel stood at the open door, peering into the void. The only light came from the flickering fire inside, casting a soft glow that barely reached beyond the porch. It was unlike anything he had experienced in years. Even in the quietest moments of city life, there had always been some noise, some light in the distance. But here, the world felt like it had been swallowed by the night. He breathed in the crisp air, feeling the cold bite at his skin. There was something strangely meditative about the silence, about the nothingness that surrounded him. For the first time in as long as he could remember, his mind felt clear, free of the constant buzz of phones and emails, meetings and deadlines. This was exactly what he had come for. This peace, this solitude. He stood there for several minutes, letting the stillness wash over him. His breath formed soft clouds in the air, dissipating into the dark. Then a sound. Crunch. Daniel's ears pricked up. It was faint at first, almost indiscernible against the distant hum of the wind, but it was there, the unmistakable sound of something or someone moving through the snow. His body tensed, his eyes narrowing as he tried to focus on the source of the noise. It was close, too close, yet the thick darkness swallowed any view beyond the porch. He could see nothing, not even the faint outline of trees just beyond the cabin. Crunch. There it was again, this time louder, more deliberate, like footsteps. They came from just out of sight, moving slowly through the snow, each step measured, careful. Daniel leaned forward slightly, as if he could pierce the darkness through sheer willpower, trying to make out any movement among the trees, but the night refused to give up its secrets. For a long moment, he stood frozen, ears straining against the silence. His rational mind was quick to offer explanations. An animal, perhaps, a deer, or some other creature of the forest, foraging in the night. But something about the sound was off. It didn't have the randomness of an animal's movements. There was a pattern to it, a rhythm, as though whatever was out there knew exactly where it was going. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, The sound stopped. Daniel held his breath, waiting, listening. He couldn't see anything, but his senses were sharp, heightened by the oppressive silence that followed. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the noise to return, for something, anything, to explain what he had just heard. Nothing. He exhaled slowly, his breath shaky, realizing only then how tightly his muscles had tensed. Forcing himself to relax, he shook his head and laughed softly under his breath. "It's the isolation," he told himself. "You're not used to this quiet. The mind plays tricks." He was about to turn and go back inside when he heard it. A whisper, barely audible, so faint it might have been carried on the wind.
"You soon will be."
Daniel froze, his heart skipping a beat. His eyes darted to the dark forest, searching for any sign of movement, any confirmation that what he had heard was real, but there was nothing, only the quiet, endless night. He stood there, his breath caught in his throat, trying to make sense of it. Had he imagined it? Was it his mind playing tricks again, conjuring sounds from the depths of his subconscious? Or had there really been a voice out there in the dark? The words echoed in his mind. He replayed them over and over. "You soon will be." The more he thought about it, the less certain he became that he had even heard them at all. His logical mind fought for control, searching for an explanation. It had to be the wind, or maybe the whisper of snow shifting in the night. Shaking his head, Daniel closed the door, bolting it behind him. He leaned against it for a moment, taking in the warmth of the fire and the familiar glow of the cabin. The world outside felt distant now, as though it had never been there at all, just not used to this quiet. He thought again, reassuring himself. It was bound to mess with him. His senses were overstimulated from years of constant noise. He would adjust. This was part of the process. But as he moved back to his armchair and picked up his book, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something just beyond the reach of the light. "You're not used to this quiet."
"You soon will be."
Daniel climbed into bed, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones, the strangeness of the night, the sound outside, the whisper. He pushed it all to the back of his mind. He told himself it was nothing more than the unfamiliar quiet, the isolation getting to him. As his body relaxed into the mattress, the warmth of the fire still lingering in the room, his eyes drifted shut, and soon enough, he was asleep. His dreams were peaceful at first. He was back on a tropical beach, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin, the sound of waves soothing his mind. It was everything he had hoped for when he'd come to the cabin. Peace, relaxation, an escape from his hectic life. But then something intruded. A sound, faint but unmistakable, a scratching at the window. Daniel's eyes snapped open. His heart pounded in his chest. His breath caught in his throat. As he strained to listen, the sound came again. Deliberate, like something scraping against the glass. He turned his head toward the window, his pulse quickening. For just a second, his eyes caught it. A face, an old face, impossibly old, with pale, wrinkled skin and sunken eyes. It hovered outside the glass, staring at him through the darkness. With a start, Daniel leapt from his bed, his heart racing as he stumbled toward the window. He pressed his face to the glass, searching the shadows outside for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Only the snow and the dense black of the night. "This is getting odd," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the image. His breath fogged the window as he stared out, his mind spinning. Could this be what happens when we switch off? When we disconnect? He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the lingering vision of that face. The skin too pale, too tight over ancient bones. Every time he tried to close his eyes, It returned, burning itself into his memory. That face. Too old to be real. Daniel didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He lay awake, alert, his mind replaying the moment over and over, each time more vivid than the last. The scratching, the face, the feeling that something had been watching him. Morning came, the dull light of dawn barely penetrating the thick clouds overhead. Daniel dressed quickly and made his way outside, his breath forming thick clouds in the freezing air. The snow crunched under his boots as he walked around the cabin, toward the window where he thought he had seen whatever it was. He knelt down, his hands tracing the windowsill, examining every inch of the glass for any sign of a disturbance. But there was nothing. No scratches, no marks. It must have been a dream, he thought. Isolation does strange things to the mind. He stood, ready to head back inside when something caught his eye. Just beyond the edge of the porch, faint and barely visible in the snow, were tracks. Small, like human footprints, but too narrow, too delicate. They led away from the cabin, towards the tree line. A chill crawled down his spine. He pulled his snow boots on properly, zipped his jacket, and, despite every instinct telling him to turn around and ignore it, followed the tracks toward the forest. The air grew colder as he moved between the trees, the snow deeper here, untouched, except for the trail that led further into the woods. He looked around, scanning the area. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that made him feel as though the world had been paused, as though he were the only living thing for miles. Then, in the distance, he saw it. Something big, just at the edge of his vision, standing between the trees. Tall, too tall to be human, its body barely visible through the shadows and snow. For a moment, Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. He remembered a show he had watched once, something about Bigfoot, and for a second, that's what he thought he was looking at. But this was different. As his eyes adjusted, he saw long silver hair cascading over the figure's shoulders, and though he could only glimpse it partially, he knew this was no creature of myth. This thing? It looked like a tall, old woman. He stood frozen, his heart pounding in his ears as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. His rational mind fought against the terror that threatened to overwhelm him. This can't be real. Not here. Not in this cold. Then he heard it again, that faint whisper, barely audible, as if it were coming from the thing, or maybe from inside his own head. He couldn't make out the words, but the voice was there, brushing against the edges of his mind like soft, cold fingers. Run! Without thinking, Daniel turned and bolted back toward the cabin. His feet pounded through the snow, his breath coming in sharp gasps as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, but still just out of reach, like a voice speaking to him from some distant, unreachable place. He slammed the door behind him, his chest heaving as the whispers stopped the moment he crossed the threshold. Silence filled the cabin, but his heart wouldn't stop racing. He locked the door, every muscle tense, his mind replaying the image of that figure in the woods. What is happening? He thought, pacing the room. Did I just see a Bigfoot? No, it looked more like an old woman. But that's impossible. In this cold? In this place? Panic started to rise in his chest. He opened the drawer, his hand shaking as he pulled out the handgun he had brought for protection. Sitting by the door, he gripped the weapon tightly, every noise outside making him flinch. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it did nothing to warm the cold dread that had settled in his bones. His mind raced, creating all sorts of scenarios, none of them comforting. As the light outside faded into the growing darkness of evening, Daniel found himself staring at the door, his fear overwhelming. waiting for whatever might come next. Daniel paced the small cabin, his mind teetering on the edge of panic. He had to get out of here. His thoughts were spiraling, circling the same dark conclusion. You're trapped. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something worse than his own fear. His breath quickened, and the overwhelming urge to escape gripped him. He grabbed his jacket and rushed outside. The cold air hit him like a wall, but he barely noticed. His eyes locked onto the SUV, half buried in the snow. He trudged through the deep drifts, adrenaline pumping through his veins, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he could drive out of this nightmare. But when he reached the vehicle, the reality hit him hard. The road was completely blocked by snow. Huge mounds, impassable. There was no way the SUV was getting through. He ran his hand through his hair in frustration, muttering under his breath. This is insane. Maybe I could hike it out of here. But even as he said it, the thought chilled him more than the cold air. The forest felt alive with menace, and whatever was out there, whatever he thought he'd seen, would make him easy prey. Don't be stupid, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. He stomped back toward the cabin, forcing himself to breathe deeply. Okay, he whispered as he slammed the door shut behind him, locking it. The best option is to sit tight. I've got provisions, I've got a gun, and I've got warmth. I'm safe, I'll bunker down, I can wait this out. The rest of the day passed in an uncomfortable silence. No strange noises, no sightings, nothing to stir his already frazzled nerves. Daniel sat by the fire, staring into the flames, letting their warmth calm him. He focused on the crackling wood, the gentle glow, and for the first time since the previous night, he felt the tension in his body begin to ease. But then, in the stillness, it came.
Daniel.
The voice, so soft at first, barely registered. He sat up, blinking, unsure if he had heard it or imagined it. But there it was again, more distinct this time.
Daniel.
His heart raced, and he grabbed the pistol from beside him, standing up quickly, his hands shaking. All right, he shouted, his voice echoing through the small cabin. I don't know who you are, but I'm armed, and I know how to handle a gun. Silence. The wind howled outside, but otherwise the world seemed to hold its breath. Then came the knock, a soft, deliberate tap on the front door. Daniel raised the pistol, aiming it directly at the door. Who's there? His voice wavered despite his best effort to sound calm. His finger hovered over the trigger. No response. Only the knock again, but this time from the bedroom window. His head snapped toward the sound. Then another knock from the back window. And then another. And another. Knock after knock from every corner of the cabin, surrounding him. Stop! Daniel screamed, spinning wildly as the knocks multiplied, coming from every side of the cabin at once. His pulse thundered in his ears, and in a blind panic, he fired a shot at the front door. The deafening blast echoed through the room, and for a brief moment, the knocking ceased. The silence was worse. The room was deathly still, but inside his head, the voices returned. Whispers. Dark, malevolent, just at the edge of his understanding. They slithered through his mind like tendrils, weaving words that he couldn't quite grasp. But the intent was clear. They were watching him, playing with him. Daniel stumbled back, clutching his head. "Leave me alone!" he screamed, his voice cracking with fear. His mind was unraveling, the pressure building inside him until he felt like he would break. Then, as clear as the wind outside, the voice came again, this time not a whisper, but strong, cold, and menacing.
Never.
Daniel collapsed to his knees, the gun falling from his hand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The room seemed to close in on him, the fire's warmth fading, replaced by a cold that seeped into his bones. He could feel them now. It, whatever it was, wasn't just in the forest. It was here, with him, in the cabin. The terror clawed at his chest as he realized he wasn't just losing his mind. Something else was here, and it wasn't going to let him go. Daniel's breath came in shallow, ragged bursts as he knelt on the cabin floor, the cold air chilling him to the core. His mind was a storm of confusion, fear, and disbelief. The fire had dimmed, casting long, flickering shadows across the room, and the oppressive silence had returned. But inside, the voice, that voice, still echoed in his head, pulling him further into the abyss of panic. He stood shakily, gripping the pistol once more, the weight of it giving him some semblance of control.
Never.
The word repeated in his mind, a promise of torment. He forced himself to his feet, trying to steady his breath. "It's just isolation," he whispered, though he didn't believe it. His rational mind clung to anything that could explain away what he had experienced. But the knocks, the whispers, the face, those were too real, too deliberate. Daniel knew, deep down, that he wasn't alone in the cabin. He checked the locks on the door, securing them as tightly as he could. His eyes darted to the windows, but nothing moved beyond the glass, except the occasional flurry of snow. Yet something still felt wrong. Every hair on his body stood on end, as though the very air around him was alive, watching. That's when he heard it. A new sound, different from the knocks. A shuffle. Something was outside, moving slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. The sound was faint, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakable. Something heavy, dragging itself through the snow. Daniel's heart thudded against his chest as he moved to the window. His hand shook as he pulled back the curtain, just enough to peer out into the night. At first, there was nothing, just the dark silhouettes of trees swaying in the bitter wind. But then, just at the edge of the tree line, a shadow moved. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it swayed as if it was having trouble standing in the snow. His pulse quickened as the shadow came closer. The faint moonlight revealed more, a long, thin figure with ragged clothes that clung to its gaunt frame, its skin pale, almost translucent. Not Bigfoot, his mind screamed. It was humanoid, but twisted in a way that made Daniel's stomach churn. Its face, what he could see of it, was wrong. The features were sunken, its eyes deep pits of shadow, and its hair, long and silver, flowed like the wind itself. It looked like an old woman, but far too tall, far too thin, like a nightmare brought to life. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the creature turned its head toward the cabin. It stood there for a moment, unnaturally still, watching. He could feel its gaze piercing through the darkness, searching for him. Then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, the creature began to shuffle toward the cabin, its steps dragging through the deep snow. Daniel backed away from the window, the pistol heavy in his trembling hands. His mind screamed for him to run, to hide, but his body was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. The cabin suddenly felt like a coffin. His pulse pounded in his ears as the shuffling grew closer. He ran to the back window, his eyes scanning the tree line, hoping, praying that he had imagined it. But there, in the pale light, he saw it again. Closer now, too close. The whispers returned, louder this time, almost insistent. They tugged at the edges of his consciousness, drawing him toward the door. Daniel fought against them, but each whisper seemed to pull a part of him away, unraveling his thoughts. He slammed his hands over his ears, desperate to block out the sound, but the voices only grew louder, more distinct. He could almost understand them now. Almost. "Come, closer." The knock came again, this time louder and more urgent, not just from the front door, but from all sides, as if the creature was circling the cabin, surrounding him. It wanted in. Desperate, Daniel shouted, "Leave me alone!" The knocking stopped. For a brief moment, silence filled the air, and Daniel dared to hope that it had left, that maybe the creature had given up. Then, a sharp, violent scratch at the window, not the soft scratching of before, but the unmistakable sound of nails dragging across the glass. The creature was right outside, clawing at the window like an animal trying to get in. Daniel couldn't breathe. He stepped back, pistol raised, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The fire crackled weakly, casting eerie shadows across the cabin. Then came the voice, low, raspy, and impossibly close.
Daniel.
His name, spoken as though the creature had been saying it for years, waiting, watching. He snapped. In a blind panic, Daniel fired a shot at the window, the deafening bang shattering the stillness of the night. The glass cracked, but didn't break. For a moment, the scratching stopped. The creature retreated into the darkness, vanishing from view. But the whispers remained.
You can't hide?
The voice was inside his head now, stronger, more insidious. It twisted through his thoughts, filling him with dread. He knew. It was only a matter of time before the creature came back, and when it did, there would be no stopping it. Daniel backed into the corner of the room, clutching the pistol to his chest. His breathing was shallow, his heart racing. His mind screamed for escape, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped, and outside in the darkness, the creature waited. Daniel sat by the door, pistol in hand, his mind racing in circles of dread and disbelief. The flickering fire offered little comfort as the cold pressed in from all sides, filling the cabin with an unnatural chill. The whispers had quieted, but they still lingered in his mind, gnawing at his sanity. Then suddenly, his phone pinged. The sound shattered the silence like a gunshot, and Daniel jumped. His heart pounded in his chest, but hope sparked in his mind. A message? Did he have a signal? Was he saved? He snatched the phone from the table, his hands trembling as he looked at the screen, but as he glanced at the top, his heart sank. No bars, no signal, but the message was there, waiting for him. A single text. "Open me, Daniel." A chill ran down his spine. His first instinct was to throw the phone across the room. This was impossible. The phone had no service. He couldn't receive messages out here in the middle of nowhere, but the words on the screen beckoned him. "Open me." His thumb hovered over the message, hesitating for a moment. Something inside him screamed not to do it, that this was all part of whatever twisted game was unfolding around him, but curiosity and desperation got the better of him. He clicked it. The message opened, revealing a grainy image of an old newspaper clipping. He squinted at the screen, the low light making it hard to see. Zooming in, the text slowly came into focus. "The Pale Whisperer, a haunting legend of the wilderness." Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he read the headline. His eyes darted down the page, scanning the text frantically. Condemned as a witch in the 17th century, the woman known as Isolde was exiled to the wilderness during a brutal winter. The villagers accused her of dark magic, of bringing the cold and death to their doorstep. Cast out, she wandered into the forest, where the blizzards consumed her. Some say she froze to death, but her spirit remained, cold, vengeful, and hungry for those who find themselves alone in the winter's grasp. Daniel's hand shook as he scrolled further. Sightings of the Pale Whisperer have been reported for centuries. She is described as tall, thin, with silver hair and skin as pale as snow. Some claim she is the spirit of the witch. Others believe she is a banshee, a wendigo, or even Bigfoot. The sightings are always the same. Those who see her are alone, isolated, cut off from the world. He felt the blood drain from his face. Every word felt like a hammer, pounding into his chest. The Pale Whisperer, the creature he had seen. It matched the description perfectly. Her face, her unnatural height, the whispers. His heart raced as he reached the end of the clipping. The last known sighting occurred in 1992, when a hiker was found dead near his isolated cabin, his body frozen solid. The local authorities chalked it up to the weather, but those who knew the legend whispered otherwise. They say if you hear her, if you see her in the snow, it's already too late. The Pale Whisperer only comes for those who cannot escape. Daniel's fingers loosened, and the phone slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. His mind was reeling, his breath shallow as he stared at the cracked screen. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the fire crackling and the cold wind rattling the windows. Then he heard it. A laugh. Faint, barely more than a breath, but unmistakable. It floated through the air like the wind, so soft it could have been imagined. But it wasn't. It was a woman's laugh. Cold, cruel, and far too close. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room. His pulse thudded in his ears as the laugh faded, leaving him in the eerie silence of the cabin once more. But now, the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with something else. Something watching. Something waiting. He backed up against the door, clutching the pistol tighter. His eyes darted to the windows, then back to the phone lying on the floor, the newspaper clipping still glaring back at him. "Leave me alone," he whispered, his voice trembling. But deep down, Daniel knew the truth. He could feel it creeping in, gnawing at his mind. She wasn't going to leave him alone. Not ever. Daniel sat in the corner of the cabin, gun in hand, his entire body trembling uncontrollably. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of his ragged breaths. He felt trapped, his mind fraying at the edges as the cold gnawed at his bones. "There's no way out," he thought, his fear closing in, suffocating him. Then faintly, he heard it, a distant rumble. At first, he thought he was imagining things again, but it grew louder. A vehicle! Daniel scrambled to his feet and rushed to the door. He flung it open, cold air blasting into the cabin as he looked out into the snow-covered expanse. There, cutting through the deep snow, was a snowplow truck. Its headlights beaming like a lifeline. The driver gave a wave as he passed, clearing a path all the way to the main road. Relief flooded through Daniel's body. "I'm saved." He wasted no time, grabbing his phone and keys, leaving everything else behind. He leapt into his SUV, starting the engine with shaking hands, and floored the gas pedal. The tires slipped for a moment before finding traction, and he sped off down the path the truck had cleared. He didn't dare look back at the cabin. He couldn't. He wouldn't. After what felt like an eternity, he merged onto the main road, passing other cars going about their daily lives as if nothing had happened. Daniel breathed a deep, shaky sigh of relief. The nightmare was over. He was back in civilization, back to safety. Hours later, he arrived home, his city looming like a fortress against the madness he had left behind. Daniel pulled into his driveway and rushed inside. His house was a sanctuary, modern and comfortable, so different from the oppressive cold of the cabin. He flicked on the security system, locking every door, as if the simple act could keep the nightmare at bay. He checked his phone. Hundreds of messages flooded in from work, friends, family. But as he scrolled, the one message that mattered was gone. The Open Me message. It wasn't there, as if it had never existed. He laughed to himself, relief overwhelming him. I went stir-crazy out there. That's all it was, he muttered, dialing up a few friends to re-establish his old routine. By the time he finished catching up and scheduling meetings, the phone was ringing non-stop. Work flooded back into his life with a comforting sense of normalcy. This, he said with a smile, this is where I belong, not out there in the middle of nowhere. Days passed, and Daniel slipped easily back into his daily routine. His mind calmed, the nightmare fading into the distance like a bad dream. He threw himself into his work with renewed vigour, answering calls, scheduling meetings, and keeping up with the relentless pace of his career. His phone constantly buzzed, his inbox always full. It was chaos, but it was familiar chaos, and that was all that mattered. One night, after a particularly long day, Daniel silenced his phone for the first time since returning. He set his alarm for 4:30 a.m., ready to get back to his demanding schedule, and crawled into bed. The city hummed outside, a distant comfort, as he drifted off to sleep. In the middle of the night, a sound stirred him from sleep. Scratch, scratch. Daniel's eyes blinked open in the darkness. Confusion clouded his mind. The cabin. No, he was home. Safe. But there it was again, a faint scratching at the window. He sat up, his heart pounding, trying to shake the grogginess from his mind. He glanced at the window, expecting to see nothing. But then, in the dark corner of his room, a shadow moved. At first, it was just a shape, barely distinguishable from the darkness itself. But as his eyes adjusted, the shape grew clearer. Taller, gaunt, inhuman, long silver hair hung from its head, and its eyes, black, empty voids, bore into him from across the room. The Pale Whisperer. No, Daniel whispered, scrambling back against the headboard, his body trembling with terror. The creature stepped forward, moving slowly, deliberately, emerging from the shadows like a nightmare made real. Its skin, pale and stretched thin over sharp bones, looked even more horrifying in the dim light. Daniel's breath came in short gasps as he tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat.
You can never leave me, Daniel.
The Pale Whisperer said, its voice cold and ancient, echoing in his mind.
You are mine.
Daniel screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The creature loomed over him, its skeletal hand reaching out, the cold radiating from its body like death itself. The next morning, Daniel's staff grew concerned when he didn't show up for his meetings. He was never late, and his absence raised immediate alarms. Calls went unanswered. His phone, usually buzzing non-stop, was eerily silent. After hours of confusion and worry, the police were called to check on him. When they arrived at his house, they had to break down the front door. What they found inside would haunt them forever. Daniel lay on his bed, his eyes wide open, frozen in an expression of sheer, unrelenting terror. His body, rigid and still, was covered in a thin layer of frost. Though the room was a normal temperature, the Pale Whisperer had claimed him. Thank you for watching. Remember, all the stories you hear on this channel are completely original. Your support, from likes, comments, and super thanks to becoming a full member, is what keeps this channel alive and thriving. I couldn't do it without you, and I'm truly grateful for each and every one of you. Stay tuned for more chilling tales, and as always, thank you for being part of the Professor Shadow family. The door to the police station swung open, and Marcus Caldwell stepped inside, bringing a cold gust of wind with him. Dressed in a sharp dark coat, Marcus moved with a sense of purpose, his eyes scanning the room like a predator searching for its next meal. He was a reporter with a reputation, a man who could twist any story into gold, even if it meant bending the truth a little, or a lot. Today, his target was the story of Daniel Kingsley's death, a top businessman found frozen in his own home, his face locked in an expression of sheer terror. The case had made headlines, but no one knew what had really happened. There were whispers of strange circumstances, rumours about the cabin where Daniel had stayed, but nothing concrete. That's where Marcus came in. He walked up to the front desk, flashing a smile at the officer seated there. "Morning," he said, his tone smooth, almost too friendly. "I'm Marcus Caldwell, with the weekly Spotlight. I was hoping to speak with the lead detective on the Kingsley case." The officer looked up, his expression immediately souring. "You're the reporter, right?" he asked, his voice flat. "We've had enough of your kind around here." Marcus kept his smile, but it was strained. "I'm just trying to get some details, that's all. I think the public deserves to know what's going on, especially with all the speculation." The officer didn't budge. "Detective Ruiz isn't taking any more questions on this case. We've already made a statement." Marcus's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Look, I'm not here to make trouble. I just want a quick word with him, off the record if necessary. I promise I won't publish anything without clearing it first." The officer hesitated, clearly debating whether to throw Marcus out or let him through. Before he could decide, a gruff voice called out from across the room. "It's fine, Barnes. I'll handle him." Detective Ruiz stepped forward, his eyes hard as they met Marcus's. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man who looked like he'd seen more than his fair share of trouble. He didn't bother to hide his disdain as he approached. "Caldwell, isn't it?" he said, his voice low and steady. "I thought I told you last time to stay out of this." Marcus's smile turned into a smirk. "You know how it is, Detective. Stories like this don't just go away. People want answers." Ruiz stepped closer, his expression darkening. "There's nothing more to say. It's a tragic case and that's it. The rest is just wild speculation. If I catch you digging where you shouldn't be, I'll make sure you regret it." Marcus raised his hands, feigning innocence. Of course. I'm just following up on some leads. Speaking of which, I heard something interesting about a cabin." Ruiz's eyes flickered, and for a split second, Marcus saw the detective's guarded expression slip. "What about it?" Ruiz asked, his tone sharp. "Just that Daniel Kingsley had been staying there before." "Well, you know," Marcus said, leaning in slightly. "I'm curious why no one's talking about that. Seems like a key part of the story, don't you think?" Ruiz didn't answer, but the tension in his jaw spoke volumes. Marcus knew he was onto something, and he wasn't going to let it go. "Listen, Detective," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If there's nothing there, I'll back off. But if you're hiding something, I'm going to find out. It's better for both of us if I get ahead of this. Don't you think?" Ruiz glared at him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, signalling that the conversation was over. Marcus took that as his cue to leave, but as he turned to go, he saw another officer whispering something to Ruiz, and for a moment, they both glanced at Marcus. Outside the station, Marcus slipped into his car and pulled out his phone. He had gotten what he needed, a sliver of information. He made a call, reaching out to a contact who used to work with the police before being quietly pushed out, the kind of person who still had access to old files and didn't mind sharing for the right price. "Hey," "It's Marcus Caldwell," he said when the line picked up. "I need a favour. Can you find me the last known address for a cabin up near Coldwater Ridge?" "Yeah, that's the one. No, I don't care how much it costs. Just get it to me." An hour later, Marcus had what he wanted: an address, directions, and a brief warning to be careful. He didn't care. All he could think about was the headline: "The Dark Secrets of Coldwater Ridge. What really happened to Daniel Kingsley?" He packed his gear, his camera, night vision equipment, and a voice recorder. If there was something at that cabin, he was going to find it, and he was going to make sure everyone knew. Marcus drove through the winding roads, the sun setting behind him as he made his way deeper into the forest. The sky turned dark, and the trees grew thicker, swallowing the last traces of daylight. By the time he reached the cabin, the world was bathed in shadows, the air cold and still. The cabin was exactly as he had imagined it: old, isolated, with an eerie stillness hanging around it. It looked untouched, as if Daniel had just stepped out and never returned. Marcus stepped out of his car, his breath visible in the frigid air, and grabbed his gear. He felt a thrill of excitement as he approached the front door, the possibilities racing through his mind. "All right, let's see what we've got," he muttered to himself, turning on his camera and stepping inside. The cabin was dark, but Marcus's night vision camera picked up everything: scattered belongings, a broken lamp, and on the table, a notebook. Daniel's notes. Marcus's eyes lit up as he flipped through the pages, catching glimpses of frantic scribbles and cryptic references to something called the Pale Whisperer. He smiled, the thrill of the hunt washing over him. Whatever this was, it was going to be big. He set up his camera near the window, positioning it to capture any movement outside. As he adjusted the lens, he noticed something strange. The air around him felt colder, and his breath was visible, even though the heating was on. "Perfect," he whispered, switching on the night vision mode and scanning the darkness outside. "Let's see what secrets you're hiding, Daniel." As he began to read through Daniel's notes, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. For a moment, Marcus thought he heard something, a soft, distant whisper. He froze, listening, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. He shook his head, forcing a laugh. "Getting jumpy, Caldwell. Don't lose it now." But as the night deepened, the cabin seemed to shift around him. The shadows grew longer, the cold more intense. Marcus adjusted his camera, glancing out the window, and that's when he saw it. A figure, far off, standing just at the edge of the tree line. Marcus zoomed in, the camera glitching slightly, but he could just make out the shape. A tall, thin figure, barely visible in the darkness. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he realized the figure wasn't moving. It was watching. A shiver ran down his spine, but he pushed it aside, the thrill of the story driving him forward. "Gotcha," he whispered, his finger pressing down on the record button. He didn't realize, not yet, that this time the story had him. Marcus sat in the dimly lit cabin, his hands trembling as he checked his camera. He frowned, scrolling through the footage. Nothing. The screen showed only static, as if the camera had malfunctioned. "No, that's impossible," he muttered, tapping the device. He had been recording the entire time, every creak, every whisper. But now, there was no evidence. It was like the camera had been wiped clean. He set it down, a sense of unease creeping over him. The air inside the cabin was colder than before, and his breath fogged up in the dim light. As he sat there, trying to make sense of the glitch, he heard it again, a faint, almost inaudible whisper.
"Marcus."
He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was so soft, like a breath carried on the wind, but it was clear enough to send chills down his spine. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room, but there was nothing there. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice wavering, but the only response was silence. Thud. The sudden, sharp noise made him jump. It sounded like something heavy hitting the wall outside. Marcus grabbed his flashlight, shining it toward the door, but the light barely pierced the darkness. The cabin seemed to be closing in on him, the shadows growing deeper, thicker. The whispers returned, this time louder, overlapping, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. They were still too faint to understand, but the tone was unmistakable, accusatory, taunting. He clamped his hands over his ears, but the voices only grew louder, echoing inside his head, like a chorus of distorted murmurs. Thud, thud, thud. The banging grew more intense, coming from different parts of the cabin. First the wall, then the window, then the ceiling, as if something was trying to force its way inside. Marcus's heart raced, his mind spinning as he struggled to hold on to his composure. He didn't want to believe in the stories, the legends, but something was here, something that wanted him to know it was watching. "Stop it," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "I'm not scared of you." The whispers stopped, leaving an eerie silence that felt even more unsettling. Marcus held his breath, his pulse throbbing in his ears, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind outside, rattling in the shutters. Then, without warning, the door burst open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crash. Marcus screamed, stumbling backward, his flashlight slipping from his hand and rolling across the floor. The cold air rushed in, swirling around the room, and for a split second, he thought he saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, tall and thin, with long silver hair. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. The door banged shut, plunging the cabin back into silence. Marcus was left standing in the darkness, his hands shaking, his mind reeling. He didn't know what was real anymore, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone. City, the newspaper office. Back in the bustling city, the office of the Weekly Spotlight was anything but quiet. Phones rang, printers hummed, and journalists rushed to meet deadlines. But in the editor's office, there was only frustration. "Where the hell is Marcus?" growled Charlie Briggs, the editor-in-chief, slamming his fist on the desk. He was a grizzled veteran of the news industry, with a short temper and a no-nonsense attitude. "I sent him out there days ago, and I haven't heard a damn thing." Two of his team, Tina Marshall and Jack Collins, stood across from him, exchanging uneasy glances. They had both worked with Marcus before, and while he was known for being a bit reckless, it wasn't like him to disappear without checking in. "Maybe he's still digging, boss," Tina suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "You know how he gets when he's onto something." Charlie glared at her, shaking his head. "No, this isn't like him. I need that story for the deadline, and if he's not back here by tomorrow, we're screwed. I'm not going to let this whole thing fall apart because he decided to play ghost hunter." He grabbed a crumpled piece of paper from his desk and tossed it at them. "This is the last location he sent me, some old cabin out by Coldwater Ridge. I want you two to head out there and bring him back. I don't care what it takes." Tina picked up the paper, glancing at the scribbled address. "You want us to just drive out there and find him? What if he's not—" "Just do it," Charlie snapped, cutting her off. "If he's not there, then I want to know why. And if he is, tell him to get his ass back here with a story, or he can find himself a new job." Jack nodded, though he looked less than thrilled about the assignment. "All right, we'll go. But if he's not answering, there might be a reason. Maybe you should do what I tell you to do and stop wasting time." Charlie interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "I've got a newspaper to run, and I'm not waiting around for him to play detective. Get out there, find him, and make sure he has something to show for it." With that, he turned away, already grabbing the phone to bark orders at someone else. Tina and Jack exchanged a final look, then headed for the door. They both knew this was more than just a routine follow-up. Something about the way Marcus had vanished didn't sit right, and they had a feeling this trip to the cabin was going to be more than they bargained for. Tina gripped the steering wheel as the car wound its way through the dark, narrow roads, the snow beginning to fall heavily. The headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the swirling flakes that danced across their path. Beside her, Jack stared out the window, his breath fogging up the glass. Neither of them had spoken much since they left the city, but as the miles stretched on, the silence became harder to bear. "Didn't think I'd be out here looking for Marcus of all people," Jack muttered, finally breaking the silence. He shifted in his seat, his expression tight with unease. "I mean, the guy's relentless, but I've never known him to just vanish." Tina nodded, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Yeah, well, maybe he bit off more than he could chew this time. You know how he gets when he thinks there's a big story. He doesn't care who he ticks off or what rules he breaks." "Still," Jack said, "it's not like him to go radio silent, especially when he was so eager to dig into this whole Daniel Kingsley thing. Makes you wonder what he found." "Or what found him," Tina said quietly, almost to herself. Jack turned to look at her, frowning, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she tightened her grip on the wheel, as if bracing herself for whatever they might find at the cabin. The rest of the drive was tense, the snowstorm growing fiercer as they climbed deeper into the forest. By the time they reached Coldwater Ridge, the wind was howling, whipping the snow into blinding sheets that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. When they finally pulled up to the cabin, they saw Marcus's car parked out front, half buried in snow. But what made Tina's stomach twist was the sight of the cabin door, wide open, swinging back and forth in the wind. The light inside flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting strange shadows across the threshold. "He's got to be here," Jack said, though his voice was more uncertain than confident. "Why would he leave the door open like that?" Tina didn't respond. She parked the car, cutting the engine, and they both sat there for a moment, neither wanting to be the first to step out into the cold. Eventually, they grabbed their flashlights and made their way through the snow, the wind biting at their faces as they approached the cabin. Inside, the scene was chaotic. The door creaked on its hinges, and the wind had blown snow across the floor, leaving wet, slushy patches everywhere. Marcus's gear was scattered around the room, but there was no sign of him. "Marcus?" Tina called out, but only the wind answered, whistling through the cracks in the walls. They searched the cabin, checking every room, every corner, but there was nothing, just empty silence. "Where the hell is he?" Jack said, frustration creeping into his voice. "His car's here, his stuff's here, but he's just gone." Tina's eyes drifted over to the table, where something caught her attention. It was Marcus's camera, lying on its side. She picked it up, hesitating for a moment before hitting the play button on the viewer. The screen flickered to life, and there was Marcus, his face illuminated by the eerie green light of the night vision mode. He looked frantic, his eyes wide with fear, darting around the room as if expecting something to jump out at him at any moment. The audio crackled, and they could hear him muttering to himself, though the words were barely coherent. Then the image shook violently as Marcus seemed to stumble, his voice rising into a scream. "No! Get away from me! Stop it!" he shouted, but there was nothing on the screen, just the empty room, and Marcus backing away from something unseen. The footage continued, but what came next was even stranger. Marcus was standing completely still, staring blankly ahead, his eyes glazed over. The video kept rolling for hours, showing him in the same position, unmoving, as if he were frozen in place. Then abruptly, the camera cut off, the screen going dark. Tina and Jack exchanged a horrified look. "What the hell was that?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Tina said, her hand shaking as she set the camera down. "But whatever happened to him? It's not normal." The storm outside had grown worse, and the temperature inside the cabin was dropping fast. Tina glanced at her watch, noting how late it was. "We're not going anywhere tonight. We'll wait out the storm and head back in the morning. We just need to get some rest and—" Thud. They both jumped, their heads snapping toward the sound. It was a soft knock, almost polite, but in the dead silence of the cabin, it was as loud as a gunshot. Tina's heart raced as she shone her flashlight toward the door, but there was nothing there. And then came the whispers, faint, almost indistinguishable, but unmistakably there, seeping into their minds like a cold mist, words they couldn't quite make out, but with a tone that was dark, sinister, and knowing. Jack shivered, rubbing his arms as if trying to ward off the chill. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tina nodded, but she didn't trust herself to speak. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, circling around them, filling the room with a sense of creeping dread. She turned her flashlight toward the corners, but every time she thought she saw something, it slipped back into the shadows, just out of sight. Thud. 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 The knocks became more frantic, coming from all around the cabin, the walls, the windows, even the floor beneath their feet. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices that seemed to be speaking directly into their minds. "What do we do?" Jack asked, his voice shaking. "We can't stay here. We have to get out." "Wait," Tina said, holding up a hand as she heard something new, a voice, clear and distinct, cutting through the noise. Knock, knock. Then, as if to answer, a louder knock echoed from the front door, and a voice called out, muffled but audible over the storm. "Anyone there?" Tina and Jack froze, staring at the door. The voice sounded calm, almost casual, completely at odds with the chaos that had been building around them. For a moment, they both hesitated, unsure whether to open the door or run in the opposite direction. "Hello?" the voice called again. "I know someone's in there. Are you going to let me in out of the cold?" Tina's hand moved to the doorknob, her pulse hammering in her ears. She glanced at Jack, who nodded, though his face was pale with fear. Slowly, she turned the knob and pulled the door open. Standing on the porch, framed by the swirling snow, was a man, tall, with a gentle, almost friendly smile, his eyes bright and warm despite the frigid air. He looked out of place, as if he had just stepped off a street corner, rather than trudged through a snowstorm to reach the cabin. "Well," the man said, his smile widening as he looked at them both. "Are you going to let me in, or are you planning to leave me out here to freeze?" Tina and Jack stared at him, their minds racing, but before they could respond, the man stepped forward, still smiling, and the wind howled, slamming the door shut behind him. "Thank you," the man said, stepping into the cabin and brushing snow from his coat. "My car is just there, but standing outside, waiting for you to open the door, was bitterly cold." He looked around the room, his eyes sharp, almost playful. "Anyway, my name is Stephen Lestat." As he spoke his name, a faint rumble of thunder echoed somewhere in the distance. Despite the heavy snowstorm, the sound was low, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down Tina and Jack's spines. They exchanged a quick, nervous glance before turning back to Stephen, who stood there with a calm, knowing smile. "I thought this cabin was supposed to be empty," Stephen said, his voice smooth, almost amused. His eyes flicked over their faces, studying them with a quiet intensity. But no matter. Now that we're all here, we should get this place warm. It's as cold as the grave in Horde. Something about this man was off, unsettling. He had an air of confidence, of authority, that seemed out of place, especially given the circumstances. Tina and Jack felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity as they watched him move around the room, casually inspecting the cabin as if he owned it. "So," Stephen said, turning back to them, "what are you two doing here?" Tina hesitated, but Jack spoke up. "We're looking for a colleague of ours. His name is Marcus Caldwell. He was supposed to be here, but we haven't heard from him in days. His car is outside, but there's no sign of him." Stephen's eyes lit up with interest. "Ah, a search party. How noble of you. And did you find anything? Any clues as to where your friend might have gone?" "No," Tina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just his camera. And some strange footage." "Strange, you say?" Stephen replied, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, I do love a good mystery." There was a pause, the air thick with tension, before Stephen clapped his hands together, the sound echoing through the room. "Right then, let's get a fire going, shall we? It's freezing in here." Reluctantly, Tina and Jack set about warming the cabin, gathering wood and stoking the embers in the fireplace. Stephen stood by, watching them with a bemused expression, as if this was all a game he found particularly amusing. Once the fire was crackling and the room began to warm, they all settled down, the light from the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. The atmosphere seemed to ease, the warmth seeping into their bones, and for a moment, Tina and Jack almost allowed themselves to relax, but that sense of calm was shattered when the whispers returned. Soft, insistent, like voices just beyond hearing, they crept into the room, circling around them. Tina stiffened, her eyes wide with fear, and Jack gripped the arm of his chair, his knuckles turning white. Stephen, however, did not react the way they expected. Instead of fear, a look of delight spread across his face, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Oh, how exciting," he said, his voice low and smooth. "You were right, my lord." He turned slightly, as if speaking to someone unseen. "She is here." Tina and Jack exchanged a horrified glance. You know what those noises are?" Jack stammered, his voice barely steady. "Of course," Stephen said, still smiling. "The whispers, the knocks, they are signs. Signs that she's near, waiting to make her presence known. You two are very fortunate, you know. Not everyone gets to witness something like this." Who is she?" Tina asked, though part of her didn't want to hear the answer. Stephen's smile widened, but he didn't respond directly. Instead, he stood up, brushing off his coat, and walked over to the door. "Now, my friends, I'm afraid it's time for you to leave." "What?" Jack said, confusion and fear mixing in his voice. "But the storm—" Yes, I know," Stephen interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "The snow is thick, the night is dark, but if you go slow, you should make it back to the main road without much trouble. And trust me, you'll be much safer out there than you would be if you stayed here." Tina and Jack stared at him, trying to understand. "You're telling us to leave?" Tina said. "Just like that?" Stephen's eyes darkened, and for a moment there was a flicker of something cold and dangerous behind his smile. "Yes, I am. It would be unwise for you to stay, and if by chance you should have an accident out there in the darkness." He paused, leaning in slightly. "Don't worry. I could still make use of you." Tina and Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. There was no arguing with this man. His words were both a warning and a threat. They gathered their belongings as quickly as they could, every nerve screaming for them to run, but they forced themselves to move calmly, not wanting to provoke whatever sinister presence had come into the cabin. They stepped outside, the storm slapping them in the face with cold, wet snow. The wind howled, and the darkness seemed to swallow them up as they made their way to the car, their minds reeling, hearts pounding. Neither of them spoke as they climbed in, started the engine, and drove off into the night, desperate to put as much distance between themselves and that place as possible. Inside the cabin, Stephen stood by the fire, watching the flames dance. The whispers had grown louder, filling the room with their eerie, rhythmic cadence. But he did not seem afraid. Quite the opposite. He looked content, as if everything was going according to plan. When the sound of the car engine faded into the distance, leaving only the wind and the crackle of the fire, Stephen moved to the centre of the room. He stood there, his eyes half closed, listening to the whispers as if they were an old, familiar song. "Now," he said softly, his voice echoing through the empty cabin, "now that we're alone, let's have ourselves a little talk." The whispers seemed to respond, rising in intensity, and Stephen's smile grew, his eyes glinting with a cold, dark light. The fire flared up, casting long shadows across the walls, and for a moment the room seemed to tremble, as if something vast and terrible was drawing closer, and then everything went silent. Stephen Lestat wrapped his thick coat tightly around himself, bracing against the bitter cold as he stepped out of the cabin and into the snow. The storm had subsided, but the air was still frigid, the sky a dull grey that hinted at more snow to come. He adjusted his scarf, his breath misting in front of him as he began to walk, venturing deeper into the dark, silent woods. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and the trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches heavy with frost. As he walked, he moved with purpose, unhurried, almost as if he were taking a casual stroll. But there was nothing casual about his mission. He was there for a reason that few would dare to understand. After some time, he paused, glancing around the empty forest. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening for something beyond the wind. "I can feel you're afraid," he said softly, his voice carrying through the stillness. "You don't need to be. Necros is the reason you came back, and I am here at his will." He continued walking, his eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. "You see, my lord is quite intrigued by your existence. He has allowed you to roam, to hunt, to claim those who wander too far. But now, he wishes to understand you." The forest was silent, the only sound the distant rustling of branches in the wind. But then, faintly, a shape appeared between the trees, far off, barely visible. Stephen's eyes narrowed as he caught sight of it, a tall, gaunt figure with long silver hair, flowing like wisps of smoke in the breeze. "Ah, there you are," he said, his lips curling into a smile. "I am not here to harm you. I am simply here to understand you. You are unique, a creature returned from the dead, which is a specialty for me and my family. Your power is great, and we simply want to know more about it." The pale whisperer stood motionless, her form barely distinguishable from the shadows around her. Her presence was cold, oppressive, and Stephen could feel it seeping through the air, trying to pierce his thoughts, to find a way into his mind, but he remained calm, his smile unwavering. The wind shifted, and suddenly the world around him seemed to distort, the trees blurring, the snow swirling in strange, unnatural patterns. Stephen felt a sharp, icy chill pass through him, and then he saw it. A vision, a glimpse into a time long forgotten, projected from the pale whisperer herself. The scene shifted, and Stephen found himself standing on the edge of a small village, the air thick with smoke from hearth fires. In the distance, he saw her, a woman, young and frail, standing on the outskirts, her hands clutching a basket of herbs. She looked scared, desperate, her eyes darting back toward the village, as if expecting someone to chase her. The whispers of the villagers carried on the wind, harsh and cruel. Witch, poisoner, evil. The words echoed, and the woman's face twisted with pain. She had been a healer, using herbs to cure the sick, but the villagers had turned against her, blaming her for every misfortune, every illness that struck their homes. Stephen watched as she was forced out, cast into the wilderness, the village gates closing behind her. The cold bit into her skin, the wind tearing at her clothes. She wandered through the snow, lost and alone with no shelter, no food. The days passed, and her strength faded, her footsteps growing slower, weaker. He saw her stumble, her frail body collapsing into the snow. The wind howled around her, drowning out her cries. And in that moment, as her life slipped away, she whispered a curse, a final, desperate vow. "I will return. I will have my revenge. They will all pay." The vision darkened, and Stephen felt a presence, a dark, ancient power, watching from the shadows. It was Necros, the lord of the undead, drawn to her hatred, her determination to defy death itself. He heard her plea, and in his cold, twisted mercy, he answered. The snow around her body shifted, forming into dark tendrils that wrapped around her limbs, pulling her back from the brink. She gasped, her eyes snapping open, glowing with an unnatural light. Necros granted her the gift of undeath, binding her spirit to the cold, to the darkness, allowing her to return, but not as she once was. She became something else, something more. The villagers never knew what hit them. One by one they vanished, their screams lost to the wind, their bodies never found. The legend of the Pale Whisperer was born, a story told to frighten children, to warn them not to stray too far from the village, lest they too fall prey to the spirit that lingered in the cold. The vision faded, and Stephen was back in the woods, the Pale Whisperer still standing in the distance, watching him. He could feel her power, her hatred, as if it were a tangible thing, pressing down on him, but he did not flinch. "This is good," Stephen said, his voice low and calm. "You were once a woman, cast out, left to die, but you returned, and now you walk these woods, claiming those who wander too far. Fascinating." He took a step forward, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. "I wish to understand you." The air grew colder, and Stephen felt a pressure in his mind, like icy fingers trying to dig into his thoughts, to twist his emotions, to make him feel the fear that the Pale Whisperer thrived on. But instead of recoiling, he laughed, the sound echoing through the empty woods. "You cannot harm me," he said, his smile widening. "I am protected by our Lord. Necros has granted me his favour, and as long as he wills it, I am beyond your reach." The Pale Whisperer seemed to waver, her form flickering like a shadow caught in a storm. The whispers around them grew louder, more frantic, as if they were trying to drown out Stephen's words. But he stood firm, his eyes locked on hers, unafraid. "Now," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "Let's see what else you have to show me. We're alone after all, and I have all the time in the world." The woods fell silent, the air still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Stephen Lestat turned away from the Pale Whisperer, the cold wind whipping around him as he made his way back through the snowy woods. He walked with a purpose, a satisfied smile on his lips, the snow crunching softly beneath his boots. He didn't look back, but he spoke clearly, his voice carrying through the silence. "Thank you," he said, his tone almost reverent. "Thank you, Pale Whisperer." The figure remained still, watching him from the shadows, her hollow, dark eyes unblinking. Stephen paused for a moment, as if savouring the stillness of the moment, then continued, "I have the knowledge I need. We are now allies under Necros. You are free to take those who venture into these woods, as you have always done. But understand this, you are no longer bound by them." He stopped, glancing over his shoulder, his eyes gleaming with a cold, dark light. "You are free," he said, his smile widening, "and there are so many more people in the city waiting, unaware. I will be your ally in death, guiding them to you." The pale whisperer remained silent, her form barely distinguishable from the dark trees, but the air around her seemed to shift, a cold wave radiating outward as if she understood his words. Stephen nodded, satisfied. "I now have the knowledge I sought," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Soon, death will walk this earth once again, and it will not be limited to these woods. It will spread, reaching far beyond this place." Months later, a new visitor. The cabin sat quietly in the woods, untouched and undisturbed. Snow piled high on the roof, the storm having passed long ago, leaving a serene stillness behind. For months, there had been no strange noises, no whispers in the night, no frantic knocks or screams. It was as if the cabin had finally been left in peace. Then, one evening, a new visitor arrived. A man, tired from the long drive, seeking a retreat from the chaos of his daily life. He parked his car, unloaded his bags, and stepped inside, smiling as he took in the rustic charm of the place. It was exactly what he had been looking for, a place to disconnect, to unwind. He didn't notice the way the shadows seemed to deepen around the cabin, or how the air grew colder, just for a moment, as he stepped inside. He was alone, or so he thought, and the stillness of the place comforted him. There were no whispers, no unsettling sounds to disturb his peace. But the cabin was no longer the epicenter. The dark presence that had once haunted its walls had found a new playground, a new hunting ground. Far from the isolated cabin, the city hummed with life. People rushed through the streets, cars honked, and lights flickered in the distance. But at the edge of the city, just beyond the bustling noise and activity, a cold mist began to gather, rolling in like a slow, creeping tide. The air grew frigid, biting at the skin of those who walked too close to the foggy outskirts. And there, at the boundary between the city and the wilderness, stood the pale whisperer. Her tall, gaunt figure loomed in the mist, her long, silver hair drifting like wisps of smoke. She watched the city, her dark eyes unblinking, her presence seeping into the shadows, spreading through the alleyways and streets like a silent plague. The cold surrounded her, a chill that went beyond the physical, cutting into the soul. She could feel the life of the city pulsing, vibrant and full, and she smiled, knowing it was all within her reach. She was no longer confined to the woods. She had been given the freedom to claim more than just the occasional wanderer. She would take many, and she would not be stopped. Stephen's laboratory, the power of undeath. In a dark, hidden laboratory far from the woods, Stephen Lestat stood over an operating table, his eyes glinting with manic excitement. The room was filled with strange, arcane equipment, tubes and vials bubbling with unknown liquids, and the air was thick with the scent of chemicals and decay. On the table lay a single corpse, pale and lifeless, its eyes closed. Stephen watched, his breath held, as he completed the final adjustments, a sense of anticipation building within him. "This is it," he whispered, his hands trembling slightly as he placed his tools aside. "The power of undeath, the power to raise the dead." He took a step back, his gaze fixed on the body, and then slowly the corpse began to move, Its chest rose, a shallow, ragged breath escaping its lips, and its fingers twitched, curling into a fist. The eyes opened, dull and glassy, but unmistakably alive. Stephen smiled, a look of triumph spreading across his face. "Yes," he said softly, his voice echoing in the dim room. "That's it. Rise, my son." The corpse sat up, its movements slow and stiff, as if awakening from a long, dreamless sleep. Stephen watched, his eyes shining with a dark, twisted joy. "Soon you will have 1,000,000 brothers, my son," he said, his voice growing louder, more fervent. 1,000,000 followers of Necros shall walk this earth, and death will reign once more. The Pale Whisperer was free, and now Stephen had the key to bringing the dead back to life. Together, they would unleash a darkness that had not been seen in centuries, a darkness that would spread across the world, consuming all in its path. And as the first of the dead stood before him, obedient and silent, Stephen Lestat's laughter filled the room, echoing through the dark halls, a chilling promise of what was to come. The Pale Whisperer, the dark descent. The city sleeps, unaware of the creeping shadow that now lurks at its edge. A cold mist rolls through the streets, curling around lampposts, seeping into dark alleys, and wrapping itself around the unsuspecting. The Pale Whisperer has come, no longer confined to the silent woods, but free to hunt in the heart of the city. Her presence is a chill in the air, a whisper on the wind, a flicker of movement in the corner of your eye. Those who hear her voice feel an icy hand on their soul, dragging them toward a fate they cannot escape. I am no longer bound, and you will not escape me. Meanwhile, deep underground, in a forgotten part of the city, Stephen Lestat's plan unfolds. The first of his undead army awakens, hollow eyes glowing in the darkness, cold breath rising from decaying lips. More and more rise to join him, brought back from the dead, their faces expressionless, their movements mechanical, but their purpose clear. You shall rise, my children. You will walk this earth once more, and the living shall fall before you. The whispers grow louder, the mist thicker, as the Pale Whisperer and the army of Necros converge, a dark alliance, ready to unleash chaos and death. There's no place left to hide, no safety in the crowded streets. The city is a playground for the damned, and the night belongs to them. But as the darkness descends, a single question remains: what can stop them? The shadows close in, and the whispers carry a single, chilling promise. You cannot escape death. It is already here. coldest night. The city lay shrouded in darkness, unusually silent, as if the very life had been drained from it. A strange, unnatural cold gripped the streets, seeping into the buildings, winding through alleyways and reaching into every hidden corner. In the dead of night, people huddled in their beds, covers drawn tightly around them, yet the chill found them, clinging to their skin, pressing into their bones. It began as a faint sound, a whisper, barely audible, weaving through the air like a dark lullaby. The voices were soft, sinister, like someone calling just beyond sight. One by one the sleeping stirred, eyes fluttering open in the darkness. Fear crept over them as they strained to listen, hearts pounding, but there was nothing they could see, only the shadows stretching across the room. Alone in their beds, they felt the presence, cold and heavy, as if something was watching, waiting. Whispers grew louder. Each victim lay still, paralyzed by the icy dread, as the voice grew clearer, colder, calling them, drawing nearer. Their breaths quickened, the room seeming to close in, walls fading as the whisper grew louder, echoing through their minds, filling them with a nameless terror. Some tried to reach for the light, but their hands wouldn't move, limbs frozen by the weight of their own fear. Room to room, house to house, the whisperer drifted, her pale form sliding like mist through walls and doors. Her cold, hollow eyes peered into the darkness, seeing each soul cowering beneath blankets, the last fragments of warmth slipping away as she drew closer. Her touch was a silent curse, her gaze a death sentence. She needed no weapons, no words. Just the suffocating chill of her presence was enough. And so, the city fell silent once more, as victim after victim succumbed to her power, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer, unimaginable terror. When dawn broke, it cast a dim, grey light over a city struck by horror. Word spread like wildfire. Police sirens pierced the morning air. Neighbours gathered in shock, their faces pale as they recounted the stories of those who hadn't woken. Hundreds of people, ordinary, innocent souls, were found lying in their beds, their bodies frozen, their eyes wide, their faces twisted in expressions of fear that could never fade. The pale whisperer had claimed them all. Stephen Lestat moved with eerie calm through the streets, his face a mask of solemn concern as he spoke with the authorities. A mass tragedy had struck overnight, and he had offered his services to assist. His reputation as a brilliant, albeit eccentric, scientist opened doors, and his voice was soft, reassuring, as he questioned each officer about the strange deaths. Hinting at answers he claimed to be pursuing for the good of the city. But in truth, Stephen had a far darker purpose. Those who had perished were no longer just victims. They were his potential soldiers, an army waiting to be awakened. He carefully persuaded the authorities to allow him to take possession of the bodies for specialized research on the unexplained deaths. By mid-afternoon, his vans were loaded, filled with the frozen corpses, each face frozen in the stark, horrifying expression of death they had met in the night. As he directed his staff to unload the bodies at his private lab, Stephen's face broke into a dark, triumphant grin. Yes, he thought, she will supply me with perfectly preserved bodies, an endless fuel for our army. His whispers to Necros went unanswered, but he felt the approving gaze of his dark lord. He knew he was fulfilling the vision they had shared. Inside his hidden laboratory, hundreds of bodies lay neatly lined on the floor, a morbid assembly, men, women, and even children, all victims of the pale whisperer. To any ordinary person, it would have been a scene of unspeakable horror, but to Stephen, it was magnificent. Like a man possessed, Stephen darted from one body to the next, his hands trembling with excitement. He uncorked a vial of thick, greenish liquid, swirling it for a moment before pouring it down the throat of each corpse. The concoction was vile, A toxic mix of herbs, chemicals, and something far older. A recipe whispered to him by Necros himself. As the liquid seeped down their throats, each body twitched. A faint shudder at first, and then a slow, painful jerk. The limbs stiffened, then began to move. Eyes that had once been frozen in terror now flickered open, dull and glassy, devoid of life yet filled with purpose. Yes, Stephen whispered, barely containing his exhilaration. Rise, my children, rise and serve the will of Necros. One by one the bodies sat up, moving stiffly at first, then with greater ease, as if relearning the act of movement. Stephen watched, his hands trembling with the thrill of success, as his 100-strong army rose to their feet, standing in silent obedience, awaiting his command. The room filled with the faint sound of shuffling feet and laboured breaths, a grotesque symphony that echoed through the cold, dark lab. Stephen stood before them, his eyes gleaming with manic delight. "Look at you," he murmured, his voice thick with pride. "Perfectly preserved, loyal, an army that will answer only to me, to us." He raised his arms, his voice rising in fervour. "Soon you will march. You will spread death across this city, and we shall claim all those who dare defy us." The army of the undead stood ready, silent and unmoving, awaiting the word that would send them into the world beyond the lab. And Stephen Lestat, with the power of Necros behind him, felt unstoppable. Night fell once more, and with it came a chill that seemed to creep up from the ground, spreading through the city like a poisonous fog. The pale whisperer emerged from the shadows, her form barely visible, a cold, spectral presence that seeped into the very soul of the night. She felt nothing but vengeance, her hollow eyes fixed on her goal, her mind a cold storm of anger. With silent, merciless precision, she drifted from house to house, apartment to apartment. Her touch was as frigid as death itself, claiming each victim without hesitation. Whispers filled the rooms, faint and sinister, like dying breaths caught on the wind. As her cold presence swept through each home, bodies lay still, frozen in place, their faces locked in horror, forever marked by the darkness that had claimed them. Across the city, terror gripped those who lay awake, shivering in their beds, as though an unseen hand was squeezing the life from their very hearts. People felt the chill of her approach, an inexplicable, soul-deep cold that froze them in place, unable to escape the fate that awaited them. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the night ended. Morning, panic in the city. When dawn broke, the city was in a state of chaos. Word spread rapidly, frantic whispers of fresh victims found in their beds, perfectly preserved but lifeless, their faces twisted in terror. Fear took hold of the people. Families locked their doors, neighbours avoided each other, and no one dared venture out after dark. But Stephen Lestat was ready. He approached the authorities with a carefully crafted story, his voice steady, a tone of urgency in his words. He explained how these strange deaths could be the result of a new, unknown disease, one capable of spreading like wildfire. For the safety of all, he advised, the bodies should be quarantined, moved to his private facility, a disease research centre. He assured them was equipped with state-of-the-art security. "There's no time to waste," he insisted, his voice calm but insistent. "Any one of these bodies could contain the outbreak. Only my facility has the equipment necessary to ensure this doesn't spread." Reluctantly, the authorities agreed, and by afternoon, van after van rolled up to Lestat's private morgue, a secure, unmarked facility on the outskirts of the city. They unloaded the corpses, each one carefully transferred to Stephen's hands. his team under strict orders to keep them isolated. Stephen watched each body arrive with an intense, barely contained joy. To the untrained eye, he looked like a scientist simply doing his duty, but inside, his heart raced with excitement. He watched as his patients were carried through the doors, rows of frozen faces, all ready to become part of his grand design. As the last body was brought into the morgue, Stephen could barely contain his delight. He moved through the room, trailing his fingers over the corpses, his lips curling into a wicked grin. Hundreds of victims lay before him, silent and still, a perfect army awaiting his command. The pale, lifeless faces stared back at him, their expressions frozen in their final moments of terror, and to Stephen, each face was a triumph, a mark of his rising power. "Yes," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Yes, you will serve me, each and every one of you. Together, we will bring death back to this world." His voice rose to a fever pitch, echoing through the cold, sterile room. He turned to the ceiling, arms stretched wide, his laughter filling the space, a sound of pure madness and exhilaration. "There is no one who can stop me," he cried out, his eyes gleaming with fervour. "I am Lestat. I am the Necromancer, and death shall walk this earth again." The words hung in the air, a dark promise, a proclamation of power that resonated through the walls, and as he stood in his morgue, surrounded by the bodies of the fallen, Stephen knew he was unstoppable. The Pale Whisperer would bring him more, and his undead army would rise, legions of the dead, ready to follow his every command. His laughter echoed in the silence, a chilling sound that seemed to blend with the very whispers that haunted the city, as if the Pale Whisperer herself was pleased by her allies' twisted ambition. Stephen Lestat stood alone in his darkened lab, his gaze fixed on the rows of bodies before him, each one a silent soldier in his growing army. His face was alight with a mix of reverence and fervour as he spoke softly, as though in conversation with a presence only he could perceive. "You were right, my lord," he murmured, his voice low and filled with awe. "She is perfect for the creation of our army. She will continue to bolster our numbers, and she will never stop." Lestat closed his eyes, and in that moment he glimpsed a vision of the Pale Whisperer's past, a tale of innocence twisted by the hand of Necros. Centuries ago, in a time long forgotten, Isolde was beloved by her people. Her village, a modest settlement, nestled in a lush valley, was kept healthy by her tireless work. She was their healer, their guardian, the one they turned to when fever struck or wounds festered. With her knowledge of herbs, she crafted remedies to soothe pain, cure sickness, and protect her people from disease. Her gentle heart, her unwavering kindness, made her a beacon of hope in a world filled with uncertainty. But even in those peaceful days, whispers had begun to spread. They were quiet at first, like faint murmurs drifting through the village, a creeping doubt that darkened her reputation in the eyes of those she loved. The whispers were insidious, growing louder with each passing day, feeding on fear and suspicion. "How does she know so much?" they asked. "Why does she live alone away from the others? Could it be witchcraft?" Unbeknownst to Isolde, it was Necros himself who had sown these seeds of distrust. The Dark Lord's voice slithered into the minds of the villagers, subtle and persistent, bending their thoughts, planting fear where there had once been only love. He had a plan for her, a twisted purpose that only he understood. In her despair, her anger, she would become his, a weapon moulded by betrayal. The villagers turned on her with the cruelty of those convinced of their own righteousness. They drove her out, cast stones and slurs, until she was forced to flee into the wilds, into the cold, where she would face her death alone. And as she lay in the snow, her final breath slipping from her lips. She whispered a promise of vengeance that Necros heard, a promise that would bind her to him forever. Present day, the March of the Dead. The vision faded, and Stephen found himself back in the present, standing before his army, hundreds strong, the risen dead, with empty, glassy eyes, awaiting his command. He could feel the power thrumming through them, a dark energy that connected each corpse to him, a conduit of Necros' will. Lestat's eyes gleamed, and he lifted his arms, his voice echoing through the cavernous room. "I am ready, my lord," he proclaimed, his tone filled with uncontainable excitement. "I can wait no longer. Today, I will march on them, and the Whisperer will feed our army. Together, we will conquer the living." He looked over the legion of dead before him, his lips curling into a dark smile. "Soon, all shall bow to Necros. Let it be so." The undead stirred at his words, a ripple of movement spreading through the crowd. The time had come. The pale Whisperer would do her work in the night, claiming more souls, and each body would strengthen their ranks. Each spirit would swell the army of Necros. And as Stephen prepared to unleash his army upon the city, he knew there would be no stopping them. The living would fall, and the world would remember the name of Lestat, the Necromancer. Night descended over the city like a shroud, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out with icy fingers. As the clock struck midnight, the pale Whisperer moved silently through the streets once more, her form barely visible, but her presence felt by all who lay in their beds, gripped by a cold that no blanket could warm. Her anger seethed, her resolve hardened by vengeance, and she drifted from one home to the next, claiming life after life, each victim joining her in death's embrace. But tonight, there was something different in the air. Suddenly, a commotion broke out on the far edge of the city. From the dark woods beyond the town limits, an army of 200 undead emerged, moving in lockstep, their faces blank, their eyes hollow, driven by a single, unrelenting purpose. Stephen Lestat, hidden in the shadows on the outskirts, watched with dark satisfaction. He stayed back, careful not to reveal his connection to the attack, but his heart thrilled with the sight of his growing army. As the undead advanced, chaos erupted. Screams filled the night as they broke into homes, dragging the living from their beds and attacking without hesitation. Each bite from the undead carried Lestat's twisted creation, a toxic rebirth, a dark contagion that turned the living into the dead. It wasn't long before those bitten rose, their eyes glazed, and joined the ranks of the undead. The army grew, doubling in size as it consumed everything in its path, a plague of death sweeping through the city. The city's authorities scrambled to mount a defense, but the response was futile. Police, firefighters, and even local militias attempted to hold the line, but each wave of resistance only added to Lestat's forces. For every defender who fell, another undead rose, their bodies twisted into soldiers for Necros. Lestat watched from the shadows, a dark smile on his lips as the city descended into madness. He looked over the sea of undead, his heart swelling with triumph. The world was finally bending to the will of Necros, and he, Lestat, was the instrument of that destruction. "My lord," he whispered, looking to the sky, "everything is going according to your will." But then, in the dead silence that followed, he heard something unexpected. A low, deep howl echoed through the night, resonating from somewhere within the city. Lestat's smile faltered, and his eyes narrowed. He looked up to the sky, and there it was, the full moon, casting an eerie glow over the chaos below. Another howl pierced the air, louder, primal, vibrating with a power that made Lestat's heart skip a beat. "No," he murmured, his face tightening with concern. "They wouldn't dare." He turned his gaze toward the heart of the city, where the sound had come from, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. He knew the legends, the ancient forces that had protected this world in times long past, and if they were answering the call, if they dared to confront him and the army of Necros, then his victory might not be as certain as he thought. Another howl shattered the night, echoing through the streets, and Lestat could feel the power rising. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. This was no ordinary resistance. Something ancient had stirred, and for the first time, Lestat's confidence wavered. The army of the undead marched on, relentless, consuming all in its path. But now, somewhere in the shadows, something else was moving, something powerful, something that would not let the city fall without a fight. And as Lestat stared into the night, he realized his conquest had awakened more than he had bargained for. The city was in chaos, gripped by an unstoppable force of death and decay, while the pale whisperer roamed through homes and claimed victim after victim, leaving a trail of frozen terror in her wake. The undead army pressed on, moving like a dark tide through the streets. A desperate attempt to barricade the central avenues had been made. Soldiers lined the hastily constructed barriers, their faces tense and fearful as they held their positions. "Hold your ground!" a captain shouted, his voice barely audible over the panicked murmurs of his men. The soldiers peered into the shadows, their minds racing with questions. Was this some kind of riot? A terrorist attack? None of them could imagine the horror that awaited. And then, from the darkness, they emerged. Hundreds of undead creatures, shuffling, staggering, but with a relentless determination. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, and the green ooze that animated them glistened under the dim streetlights. "Open fire!" the captain commanded, and the soldiers obeyed without hesitation. Gunfire rang out, bullets tearing through the undead. Bodies fell, limbs were torn apart, and for a moment it seemed they might succeed in holding them back. But the wave of undead kept coming, their numbers too great, and the soldiers found themselves quickly overwhelmed. "Prepare to retreat," the captain yelled, his voice strained. "We cannot hold them off." But before the soldiers could pull back, a dark, hulking shape shot through the air, leaping over their heads and crashing into the fray. A second shape followed, both landing with a thunderous impact that sent shockwaves through the ranks of the undead. The soldiers stared, stunned, as two massive beasts tore into the enemy lines, their claws slicing through the undead like they were paper. Two primal werewolves, the Alpha Prime and the Alpha, had arrived. These were no ordinary wolves. They were embodiments of pure power, creatures of raw muscle and rage. Their eyes glowed with a fierce ancient light, their fur bristling as they unleashed their fury on the undead. One by one, the undead fell before their claws, heads severed, limbs torn apart, bodies broken beyond repair. The werewolves moved with primal grace, each strike purposeful, each kill decisive. A soldier let out a triumphant shout. "Yeah, they're on our side. Give them some support." The soldiers, hearts lifted by this unexpected help, took aim once more, picking off the undead with renewed determination. Each shot counted, each bullet finding its mark as the soldiers fought side by side with the two massive wolves. The werewolves tore through the undead ranks, their roars and growls blending with the gunfire in a terrifying but exhilarating symphony. Minutes later, the battlefield was silent. The undead lay in twisted, motionless piles, green ooze leaking from their broken bodies. The Alpha and the Alpha Prime lifted their heads to the sky, unleashing a victorious howl that reverberated through the city, a sound of defiance and victory against the forces of darkness. From his hidden vantage point on the outskirts, Lestat clenched his fists, watching in furious disbelief as his precious undead fell. His lips curled in a sneer, but then his expression changed. A dark, twisted smile spreading across his face. "Go ahead. Celebrate," he whispered to himself. "But how do you plan to kill the dead?" Back at the barricade, the soldiers lowered their weapons, breathing sighs of relief. But as the silence settled, one of them shouted, "What's that?" They watched in horror as the green ooze began to pool together, seeping from the shattered remains of the undead bodies. Slowly, it crawled back toward the corpses, merging with them, filling in the torn flesh and broken bones. One by one, the undead began to stir, their limbs knitting back together, their eyes flickering to life. The Alpha and the Alpha Prime exchanged a look of concern. The Alpha, visibly fatigued from the fight, shook his head, his breaths heavy and laboured. They had never encountered anything like this. These undead were no ordinary enemies. They were fueled by the dark essence of Lestat's creation, a force that defied all natural laws. The werewolves watched, disbelief and frustration in their eyes, as the undead bodies rose, their wounds closing before their very eyes. The creatures stood once more resilient, almost fluid, their forms seeming to shift like water with each movement. The bullets fired by the soldiers passed through them, creating holes that closed as quickly as they appeared, the green ooze now acting as both flesh and armour. Realising they were outmatched, the Alpha and the Alpha Prime leapt back behind the barricade, joining the soldiers, who stood frozen in terror. The soldiers fired desperately, but their bullets had no effect this time. It was like shooting into a mass of liquid, an enemy that could not be stopped. Lestat watched from afar, his eyes gleaming with triumph as the undead army advanced once more. He threw his head back, laughing into the night, his voice dripping with victory. "Yes, my lord," he shouted to the heavens. "Everything is going according to your will. Soon the living shall fall, and all shall bow to Necros." And as the full moon shone down on the chaos below, the Alpha Prime and the Alpha looked at each other, their expressions grim. They had faced countless threats, fought battles across centuries, but never had they seen anything like this. For the first time, the primal wolves understood that they were up against a force that defied even their strength. The undead moved forward, unstoppable, their hollow eyes fixed on their living prey. The battle was far from over, and the city's last line of defence had only just begun. Pale Whisperer entered yet another quiet home, her form like a shadow slipping through the walls. She moved to the bed where a man lay sleeping, his breaths even, undisturbed by her presence. Leaning close, she whispered into his ear, the chill of her voice slipping into his dreams, ready to claim yet another life. But just as she prepared to take him, the man stirred, sitting up slowly. His voice was calm, almost tender, as he looked at her with eyes that seemed to pierce through her very being. "Hello, Isolde." The Whisperer froze, a wave of shock washing over her, her cold mask of vengeance momentarily cracking. She took a step back, her hands tightening as rage boiled within her. How did he know that name? Her name? "I have but a few precious seconds to help you, my dear," the man said, his voice calm and steady. "So please, don't try to kill me just yet. Give me but a moment, and if after this you still wish my life, then by all means take it." The Whisperer, driven by blind fury, lunged at him, ready to silence him. But then she saw it, the glint of his face reflecting in the dim light. Only It wasn't a face. It was a chrome mask, shining back at her like a mirror, capturing her own distorted image. "You have been betrayed, my dear," he said, his voice taking on a mournful tone. "I have used all my power to reach you for these few moments, and I must return soon. But let me show you something first." Before she could protest, he raised a hand, and suddenly the world shifted around her. The Whisperer found herself standing in her village, the place she had once called home. She was no longer the vengeful spirit known as the Pale Whisperer. She was Isolde once more, young and full of hope. She moved through the streets, tending to the sick, offering herbs and remedies to the ailing, her heart filled with kindness and compassion. She looked down at her hands, clean and warm, her touch a balm rather than a curse. She saw the faces of the villagers, their eyes bright with gratitude as she healed their wounds and soothed their fevers. She had saved them countless times, her knowledge of healing a gift that had kept the village alive through hardship and illness. But as she turned, she saw something that chilled her to her core. Standing behind one of the villagers she had just cured was a shadow, a dark, twisted figure, whispering into the villager's ear. The man she had saved turned, his expression shifting from gratitude to suspicion, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at her. The figure behind him was unmistakable, an embodiment of Necros, his sinister presence tainting the villager's mind. Isolde's breath caught as she realized that Necros had been there all along, poisoning the minds of those she had once called family, planting seeds of fear and distrust in their hearts. The masked man beside her pointed to other villagers, and she saw Necros beside each of them, whispering in their ears, filling their minds with doubt and fear. The entire village had been swayed by his influence. Their love for her turned to hatred, their gratitude transformed into rage. They had driven her out, cast her into the wilderness to die, not because of her deeds, but because Necros had willed it. In that instant, she was back in the darkened room, standing before the man in the mask, his voice softened, filled with a sorrowful compassion. "You have been betrayed, Isolde. This vengeance, it is not yours. It was never meant to be." The man looked at her with a steady gaze, as though he could see straight through her, to the soul that lay buried beneath layers of rage and bitterness. "My time is done here," he said quietly. "Reality calls me elsewhere. I hope you see the truth, Isolde, for this is not who you are." He turned, his form beginning to fade, his outline blurring into the shadows. But before he disappeared entirely, she caught one last glimpse of his mask, its mirrored surface reflecting her image, and behind her, the dark, spectral form of Necros, his twisted mouth close to her ear, whispering words of hatred and anger. Isolde stared at the reflection, her mind racing, her heart aching with a forgotten pain. Had her life and death been a lie, twisted to serve another's purpose? The masked man's words lingered in her mind, unraveling the rage that had driven her for centuries. As the room fell silent once more, she stood there, alone, her mind torn between the vengeance she had sworn and the truth that had just been revealed. The Alpha Prime and the Alpha, battered but unbroken, prepared to leap back into the fray, their primal forms coiled with fury, ready to charge at the undead horde once more. The soldiers around them readied their weapons, bracing for what they believed would be their last stand. But before any could move, a strange sound filled the air, a whisper, soft and rhythmic, a language none recognized, yet all understood on a primal level. The whispering voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, weaving through the night like a spell. The Alpha and the Alpha Prime halted, ears pricked, their muscles tense. The soldiers lowered their weapons, eyes widening in confusion and awe. An icy fog rolled over the barricade, cloaking everything in a pale, ghostly light. The undead continued their relentless advance, clambering over the makeshift barricades, reaching out with decaying hands. But then, abruptly, they stopped. Lestat, observing from his hidden vantage point, squinted, his confident smirk faltering as he watched his precious army falter. A change rippled through the undead ranks. They began to twitch, jerking their heads, as though hearing something from all directions at once. Panic spread across their twisted faces, their hollow eyes darting wildly. The soldiers watched in disbelief as the undead began to turn on one another, their limbs flailing as they clawed at anything within reach, including their own ranks. A bizarre, chaotic scene unfolded as the undead clashed with one another, driven by unseen forces, their own bodies no longer under Lestat's control. Those who had once been bound by Necros' green, viscous ooze were now tearing each other apart, bones cracking and limbs flying in a nightmarish frenzy. In moments, the streets were filled with chaos as undead fought undead, their mindless violence consuming them until nothing was left. Within minutes, the entire horde lay in ruins, their twisted bodies littering the ground in broken piles. Only a few undead remained, staggering toward the barricade in their final, pitiful attempt at an attack. But as they moved, an intense cold seized them, freezing the very goo that animated their forms. The toxic ooze crystallized, spreading through their bodies like ice, until they stood as frozen statues, hollow shells of the monsters they once were. With one final shuddering breath, they collapsed, lifeless. A loud cheer erupted from the barricade as the soldiers realized what had happened. Relief washed over them, and they lifted their arms, a cheering in victory, disbelief, and joy. The Alpha Prime and the Alpha, their own blood-stained and battered, lifted their heads to the sky, letting out a victorious howl that echoed through the city, a primal cry that celebrated the unexpected reprieve. As the soldiers and the wolves celebrated, a lone soldier at the edge of the barricade caught a glimpse of something in the distance. Peering into the fog, he saw a figure, a tall, gaunt woman with long silver hair, her face worn and lined with the scars of a life long past. She stood silently, watching from the shadows, her expression unreadable, and then, to the soldier's astonishment, she smiled, a slight, knowing smile that sent a chill down his spine. He blinked, and when he looked again, she was gone, leaving only the icy fog and the broken remains of the undead in her wake. Somewhere beyond the barricades, Lestat stumbled back, his face a mask of rage and confusion. His army, his grand plan, had crumbled to dust, torn apart by forces he could not see or understand. And as he heard the howls of the wolves and the cheers of the living, he clenched his fists, his mind racing with questions. In that silent, frozen city, Lestat understood one thing. He was not the only one with power in this game. The final confrontation. Lestat felt it before he saw it, the chill creeping over him, the fog rolling in thick, icy and foreboding. He turned, and there she was, the pale whisperer, her face stern and unyielding as she looked upon him. Her presence was no longer shrouded in rage. It was quiet, intense, a force of nature in its own right. "There will be others," Lestat sneered undeterred. "Do not think this is the end. Necros has eternity, for nothing can escape death." Without waiting for a response, he marched away, his mind already whirling with new schemes, new ways to wield the undead. Isolde could feel Necros' influence clinging to him, binding him to the powers of undeath, protecting him from her wrath, for now. Then another presence stirred beside her. She turned, and her heart tightened as she recognized him instantly, the embodiment of Necros himself, now standing in human form, his gaze dark and piercing. "Well, well," he murmured, a wicked smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. So it has come to this, Isolde. But know one thing. It wasn't just me who drove you. You wanted it too. You enjoyed taking those lives as much as I enjoyed receiving them. Tell me, can you truly say you want all of this to end now? His words struck her like a knife. She could feel the cold truth he wove into his statement, a haunting echo of the rage that had fueled her for so long. She knew what this meant. Necros was ready to reclaim his power over her, to draw back his essence and erase the pale whisperer forever. A voice cut through the fog, clear and sharp. Must I really face reality-destroying entities without having to come back here to solve your problems, Necros, even if just for a day? The ground trembled as a figure stepped forward, a man in a long coat, his face concealed behind a chrome mask. Winter. Necrov's face twisted with annoyance. "She is mine," he hissed, his voice cold with possession. "I don't think so," Winter replied, stepping between them. He looked over at Isolde, his tone steady. "It's been too long, Necros. We really should catch up." Winter's gaze softened as he addressed Isolde. "You were deceived, tricked into death, and robbed of the life you gave so freely." He glanced back at Necros, his voice calm but filled with a quiet strength. "Necros knew what he was doing, manipulating you for his own power, but there's a way out of this." Necros sneered, but Winter ignored him, his intellect already working, formulating a way to sever the bond that bound Isolde to death. He moved with precision, his understanding of reality itself weaving around Necros's ancient magic, outmaneuvering the god of undeath with every step. Necros' eyes narrowed, anger smouldering beneath his calm facade, but as he watched, he could sense it. Winter's knowledge had grown beyond even his own, his intellect vast enough to bend the very fabric of reality. With a final flourish, Winter spoke a single word in a language lost to all but the oldest of realms. Isolde felt a surge of light pass through her, a warmth she had not known in centuries. The weight of her rage fell away, dissipating like morning mist under the sun. She was free. The chains of Necros's influence shattered, and in that moment she was no longer the pale whisperer, but something pure, something renewed. Isolde turned, gazing once more at Winter, gratitude in her eyes. Without a word, she vanished, her spirit returning to the woods as a force of nature. She would be a guardian of the land, protecting its creatures, guiding lost travellers, a gentle presence rather than a harbinger of vengeance. As the fog lifted, only Necros and Winter remained. Necros glared at Winter, his expression cold and dark. "One day you will slip up, Winter," he said, his voice laced with quiet fury. "Reality has given you too much leeway." Winter shrugged, his masked face giving away nothing. "Well, Necros, I'd love to stay and chat, but at this very moment I'm negotiating the very fabric of reality with a being so powerful that even you are nothing more than one of your shambling creations to him. And if I cannot stop him, you won't have to worry about much, because none of us will exist, or have ever existed." Winter paused, his voice calm but resolute. "So, for your sake, I do hope you haven't taken too much of my time. I am the only one who can save us all, you included." With that, Winter faded from view, leaving Necros alone. The god of undeath stood in the silent fog, his gaze fixed on the place where Winter had vanished. Though his power was vast, his knowledge spanning eons, he knew, in the depths of his being, that Winter was his salvation. And for the first time in countless centuries, Necros felt a sliver of uncertainty in his immortal heart. Thank you for watching. Remember, all the stories you hear on this channel are completely original. Your support, from likes, comments and super thanks to becoming a full member, is what keeps this channel alive and thriving. I couldn't do it without you, and I'm truly grateful for each and every one of you. Stay tuned for more chilling tales, and as always, thank you for being part of the Professor Shadow family.